Elimelech picks up his family and he goes and he resettles in the land of Moab, which was a very godless and a very vile country. And running away always seems to be the right answer when we first do it, but the grass is not always greener on the other side of the fence. And Elimelech finds that out. He dies in Moab, leaving his wife, Naomi, along, not only as a widow, but along with her 2 sons. And some 10 years later, her sons have already married, but they also die, now leaving her with Ruth and with Orpah, and also as a widow. And she had no one to be with her. You see, running away from God is never the right answer at all, ever. It always leads to disaster. But last week we talked about and we discovered that running towards God is always a right direction. It's always the right direction. Now, Naomi decided to return home, and Ruth insisted on staying with her, saying, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Ruth sacrificed a whole lot to remain with her mother-in-law. And even though Ruth did not know fully the God that she was running towards, she knew it only by the words of her mother-in-law Naomi and only by the example in which she set. But she finds that running towards God is always the right direction in which we should run. But there is still yet another path, an even better path if you can imagine. And that is the path that we find the one that Boaz took, which is running after God. Running after God is always the honorable path. So today, we find Naomi and Ruth returning home, and we find that she has a kinsman redeemer. His name is Boaz. So let's begin this morning by looking at our first point, and that is simply this: a godly man. Now listen what it says in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. Now I want you to notice right away that Boaz is described as a man of standing. Now the name Boaz in the Hebrew means in him is strength. And it's also important for you and I to recognize that Boaz is included in both Matthew and Luke's genealogy of Jesus Christ. That's important. You see, Boaz is born of the tribe of Judah, which is extremely important to know and understand, considering that Judah is the kingly tribe of Israel, and all kings come out of the tribe of Judah. But he is not only a man of standing, he is also a very successful and a very kind businessman. Now, how do we know that? Well, Boaz has several fields to be harvested. He has the money to hire harvesters, and he also has the money to hire foremen that will manage that process. So when Boaz is around, he is greeted with brotherly love. In verse 4, we read these words. Boaz says, "The Lord be with you." And they respond back, "The Lord bless you." Now, the fact is, to you and I, that may seem like a very minor thing. But it's not minor at all in this case, because you see, many spots in Scripture, we don't read about the common greeting of brotherly love to one another, especially though when we come from a boss to a worker, and yet here we do, which, by the way, shows us the concern and the kindness that Boaz felt for those who worked for him. But not only do we find that mutual respect, but we see that he admires Ruth's devotion. Ruth chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. Boaz asked the overseer of the harvester, "Who does the young woman belong to?" And the overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi," she said. Naomi. She said, "Please, let me glean and gather from among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field, and she has remained here from morning until now, except for a very short rest and shelter. Her devotion and her willingness to work as hard as she did touched deeply Boaz. I mean, even to the point of her love and her devotion for her mother-in-law, her willingness to do whatever it took to provide not only for her but also for herself. Boaz invites her to stay in his field. Now, you'll remember from last week, we talked about the fact that in Israel, it was not only a custom to allow people to glean, but it was also commanded by God. Listen what it reads once again in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 through 21. When you are harvesting in your field and overlook a sheaf, do not go back for it. Leave it for the foreigner, for the fatherless, and for the widow, that the Lord your God may bless the work of your hands. And when you beat the olives out of the trees, do not go back over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner and for the fatherless and for the widow. And when you harvest grapes from your vineyard, do not go back over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner and for the fatherless and for the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that is why I command you to do this. Once again, God wanted to remind them that there was a time in your life that you had little to nothing. And you understand what that feeling is like. So when you're doing this, allow people to come to your field. Allow people that have little to nothing to glean. Why? because they might do this and see the grace and the mercy of God. So while it is both customary as well as a command along the gleaning in the field, a person didn't always have to allow you to glean in the field longer than a day. See, the custom only called for letting you glean. They didn't have to let you stay there for hours upon end, and they didn't have to let you come back the next day either. You see, it was uncommon. It was uncommon for a person to allow a gleaner to stay longer than a day. But what was not uncommon is that when a gleaner was in your field, that they would be harassed. They would be harassed by the harvesters for many different reasons, sometimes for getting in the way, and sometimes because of who you are, maybe even your socioeconomic status. But you would be harassed. But Boaz, which by the way shows a lot about his character, asks her not only to remain gleaning in his field for both harvests, both the barley and the wheat, but for the rest of the time, he says, if you are tired, take a rest. If you're thirsty, make sure that you take something to drink. So understand, really what he is saying to her simply is this: I'm telling you this, you will be taken care of here. You see, when most gleaners were going through, it was nonstop work constantly, because if I don't get to work and work extremely hard, somebody else may get more than me, or I may wind up with nothing. And so they used to glean hard and they gleaned fast in order to gather all that they could. But here Boaz says, you work, but when you need a break, take it. When you're thirsty, drink. And your gleaning will remain open in my field all the time. See, Boaz adds this in Ruth chapter 2, verse 9. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along with the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. In other words, I want you to know that you will be safe while you're here, that no one's going to stop you from gleaning. No one will mock you. No one will threaten you, and you are safe in my field. And by the way, when the harvesters are ready to break for lunch, Boaz invites her, even though she is a foreigner, invites her to come and go back and eat with them. And when they're ready to go back and glean again, he pulls his men to the side, and he says this in Ruth chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. Even if she gathers among the sheaves, do not embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks from her into bundles and leave it for her to pick up. Do not rebuke her. His compassion for her is amazing. He looks at her as if she's a daughter, a younger woman who deserves respect and honor as God always calls. Knowing what she has done for Naomi and knowing how hard she has worked, it pleases him to be able to help her. And you can imagine the comfort and the joy that this must have given Naomi to find that Ruth had been gleaning in the field of Boaz. Because Naomi knew that yet again, God was providing for him or for her and for Ruth. Which, by the way, this morning will take us to our next point. And that is this: it's a compassionate answer. Naomi, being the woman that she was concerned with Ruth, wanting to make sure that she was placed in a home where she could have a life of joy, know the joy of having children, a place that she could call her own. And in Ruth chapter 3, verse 1, she says, my daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Now, I want you to just think about this, and let's be honest for a moment. It would have been very easy for Naomi just to leave things as is, because if that's the case, Ruth would have remained with her no matter what. She would have continued taking care of her, providing for her, going out and getting food and bringing it back in. She would have done whatever it took to make sure that both of them had what they needed in order to survive. However, again, we see the tremendous character of Naomi in the fact that she is still concerning herself with helping Ruth find a husband, find a home. Naomi knows that she's not going to be around forever. Naomi knows the day is coming that she will go and be buried and be gone. And what will happen to Ruth at that time? She'll be an older woman living in a foreign land with no husband and no children to help her. In other words, Naomi knows exactly what Ruth would feel like. Why? Because that's exactly what Ruth felt like when she was back in Moab. No children, no husband, a foreign land. She doesn't want that for Ruth at all, because Ruth won't have anybody to go with her like Naomi did. So now Naomi offers yet again to help Ruth find a place that she will be cared for. Now, we talked about Naomi's love for Ruth and how Ruth refused to leave her because of that love. But here we see Naomi making yet another great sacrifice for Ruth, trying to get her settled. Why? Because it means that Naomi could wind up alone again. So what does Naomi do? Well, she offers advice to Ruth. And when you and I read that advice today, it sounds a bit odd. It sounds a bit unusual, but you have to understand this was the custom in Israel, and it's an extremely bold step in faith that Naomi does what she does. Listen to what it says in Ruth chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home where you will be well provided for. Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a kinsman of ours. Tonight, he'll be winnowing barley in the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes, and then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, take note of where he is lying. And then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what you must do." Now let's go ahead and step back, because let's be honest. What she just said there sounds pretty weird. It sounds a bit unusual, but I want you to understand that what you and I just read, even though it is unusual, what is happening, first and foremost, why the threshing floor? Why go down to the threshing floor? Well, because of this. It was very common at this time that the owner as well as the harvesters would remain at the threshing floor when the harvest had been brought in until all the product was done, was all taken care of. Why? Because everybody in the area knew when a harvest was coming in, and so they would stay there till the job was done, as well as protect that which was theirs, so that no one would come in and steal it. Since everybody, including, by the way, those outside of Israel, knew, it was not uncommon that threshing floors would get raided, and all the work that you just put in to breaking up the barley and getting the wheat all winnowed would all be gone. And so they would remain there until it was secure. But what about Naomi's plan for Ruth? When Naomi hears the kindness that Boaz had been showing Ruth, Naomi has to feel in her mind that the prayer that she had been praying is now being answered. And so she feels a sense of hope. And so she, knowing that Boaz was the kinsman of the family, she says, and she takes this major turning point in the story. And this is what she does. The initiative that she has Ruth to do, she has her prepare herself as a bride would for her husband. It was a very simple process of washing herself, putting on perfume and the very best clothes, and then going and presenting herself to Boaz. Now, before I go any further, I want to make sure I clear up anything that could be going through your mind right now. While it's a very bold move that Naomi has Ruth to do, there is absolutely no reason for you to think about or challenge the moral integrity of either Ruth, Naomi, or Boaz. All Naomi is doing here is having Ruth appeal to Boaz to fulfill the obligation of a kinsman redeemer. There would have been no intimacy at all, either implied or acted upon in any way, shape, or form. But I will give you this. It is a very bold request, and it took an awful lot of faith in God and courage to do this. Listen to Ruth chapter 3, verses 7 through 9. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over and lied down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer of our family." So what is happening here? Ruth's action is a request for marriage. Now, I know that sounds like an awful odd way to propose to somebody, because you and I have such more clever ways of proposing to people today, but this is exactly what she is insinuating. She wants to be his wife. Now, Naomi had advised Ruth to go to Boaz humbly, in submission, to say basically that she was there for him. I want you not to lose sight of this picture. Ruth came to claim a right. Boaz was her Goel, or the kinsman redeemer. She had a right to expect him to marry her and to raise up a family, to continue the name of Milan, which was the son of Elimelech. She had the right to do that, but Naomi gives Ruth wise counsel. She says, don't go to him as a victim demanding your rights. Be a humble servant, trusting in the goodness of the kinsman redeemer. And she essentially is saying to Boaz, I respect you, I trust you, and I put my fate in your hands. That's a whole lot better than you owe me. And that's exactly what she does. And if you remember, Boaz had already said to her in Ruth chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, I have been told of all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you've left your father and mother and your homeland to come and live among a people that do not belong to you. May the Lord repay you for all that you've done, and may you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you now take refuge. All she is requesting here on the threshing floor is that Boaz would be the hands and feet of God and provide for her the physical wings under which she can now live and find refuge. Let me ask you a question this morning. Have you ever required of God, or by default the church, something that you're not willing to do? Have you ever done that? This happens so often in society, especially in today's world. Why doesn't God stop world hunger, and yet you're not willing to feed one person outside your family? Why does God allow all the hatred in the world, and yet you justify every reason why you hate somebody for something? Why doesn't the church do more to get the gospel out in the world? Yet you show up for church when you darn well feel like it, and you never share what you hear. Why doesn't more people in the world believe in Jesus? And you think about that. Maybe the world doesn't believe in Jesus because they don't see the difference Jesus has made in your life. And if he's not going to change your life, what's he going to do for me? You see, the fact is, quite frankly, and sometimes we need to be reminded, that our life sometimes is the only Jesus people see. And if they see you and me, well, then maybe that's the reason why they don't believe. In this situation, Ruth is amazed by all that's going on. Remember, she doesn't understand this custom. Ruth is asking Boaz to be the blessing that God is offering her through the compassion that he might have. He is startled in the night. Remember, there would have been no lights at this time. He's startled in the night. He wakes up and sees a woman at his feet, and he says, "Who are you?" And when he finds out that it's Ruth, he has a joy about that. Listen to what he says in Ruth 3, verse 10 and 11. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, or whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you what you've asked. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character." Now, this is to confirm, by the way, what I said earlier about this unusual custom, because she asked him no question, had she? No, she had not. All she asked was to take your outer garment that you've got laying there and cover it over me. And what she's really saying there is, as my kinsman redeemer, will you keep me safe as my husband? Boaz promises that whatever it takes, he will do to provide for her. Why? Because she is an honorable woman of good godly character. And everyone, he says, knows that. So he will arrange either for her to be married to a kinsman that's closer in relation, or he himself will do this. And that'll take us to our last point this morning. And that is a kinsman redeemer. Ruth chapter 2, verse 20, it says, "The Lord bless him. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, he has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "That man is a close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." So what is the kinsman redeemer? Now, we talked about that in week number 1. A kinsman redeemer, or in the the Hebrew, goel, is a relative who is called by the law of Moses to perform one of 4 duties. One is simply this: to see that justice is done for a murdered relative. Numbers chapter 35, verse 19. The second was to marry a childless widow for a deceased brother or other relative, that they might bear children and carry on the deceased relative's name. That's Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. The third one is to buy back family land that has been lost or stolen or sold. Leviticus 25, verse 25. And number 4 was to redeem or purchase back relatives who had been lost, sold, or taken into slavery or bondage. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 47 through 49. So a kinsman redeemer was an extremely important thing to the Jewish people, because the concept always ensured protection and provision for the family. No one was ever to feel like they had no hope as long as they had a kinsman redeemer. And so Boaz does the honorable thing. He is honest, and he says, well, there is a kinsman redeemer closer in relation than I. So Boaz wants to do what's right according to the law of Moses, the obligation of the closest relative. It is their obligation, and if they could not or refused, then he would. But know this, and know this clearly today. The obligation of the kinsman redeemer was only to the closest relative. After that, the other relatives were not obligated. It was now by choice. Then the widow, of course, if no one would in the family, would have to go back to her family and live simply as a widow. See, Boaz was willing to choose the honorable obligation of the kinsman redeemer by choice if the nearest relative would not or could not do it. And so Boaz gets 10 elders to go with him. Now remember, 2 would have been enough. But he gets 10 elders to go with him. He presents the case according to the law of Moses, and he puts it to the nearest of kin. And the rightful kinsman, if you will, agrees to buy the land back. He agrees to do it. This sounds like a pretty good deal for him. And so he agrees to buy the land back. But then Boaz gently reminds him, by the way, the land comes with the widow of Elimelech's son, and you must marry her out of obligation and help bring up a son in the name of the family of Elimelech. But at this, he said, I can't do that. I can't do that. I'm not going to put my own estate in jeopardy. Let me ask you this morning, why is it that people will desire something initially, but once they realize that there's real commitment that comes with it, they no longer want any part of it? Let me give you a couple of examples. Consider a home or property. There are many people that love the idea of having their own home, their own place, but when they find out the real commitment that it takes and the hard work that goes into maintaining it, they just sometimes let it run down, thinking nothing of the fact that it'll turn to ruin. As long as they can claim that they have property and have a home, they don't really care what matters. Or what about consider a pet? How many times have you ever heard a small child say, I really want a pet, I want a pet, I want a pet? But when they have the pet and they realize it takes real commitment and real hard work to take care of it properly, they will simply drop them on the side of the road, or they'll let them fend for themselves, which sometimes could lead to death. But they don't really care about what's going on. As long as they can claim that the pet is still theirs, that's all that really matters. Or what about salvation? There are so many people that would love the fact that they can claim to be a Christian until they realize that it takes real commitment to Jesus Christ in their life, and then they just drop it. They don't study the Word of God. They don't attend church unless they want to. And when their walk with Christ begins to fall apart, it really doesn't matter to them at all. They can still claim to be a Christian, and that's all that really matters. The nearest kinsman didn't want any part of the commitment that was going to be involved in carrying out the obligation. So the next in line was Boaz. And now Boaz has a choice. He's not obligated. He has a choice. And Boaz makes his choice based on deep, sacrificial love. Boaz redeems the property and takes Ruth as his wife. And in this act of love, Boaz offers her a place of refuge, a place of safety, a place of love, a place of hope, and a place for her future. See, Boaz and Ruth do have a son. We spoke about that last week. His name is Obed. Obed has a son named Jesse. In other words, Obed becomes the grandfather of King David, through which we know the messianic line comes. You see, the kindness and the compassion of Boaz and his desire to do the right thing by God provided an avenue for God to shower blessings upon not only Ruth, but also upon Naomi, and then eventually to all people. But the story of Boaz also points me and you to a specific way that Jesus provided for us. You see, the fact is, Jesus is our kinsman redeemer by choice, not obligation. He chose to pay the price to redeem you and I back from a self-induced slavery and bondage. You and I put ourselves there, but he chose to pay the price. You see, the fact is, there's no way whatsoever that you and I could have ever paid to get ourselves out of the mess in which we had put ourselves into. It was hard to find a teacher who was willing to come and live in the Appalachian Mountains for any reason. But even when teachers would come, they wouldn't stay very long, because based on the conditions in which they lived, or sometimes based on the students in which they had to actually try to teach. There was one particular school in the mountains in the 1920s that had run through 4 teachers in 8 months. 4 teachers. The school leaders, of course, were desperate to have somebody not only come, but to have them come and teach and stay, so that the kids would have stability and have a good education. They knew what the problem was. The kids were extremely unruly. The leader of the kids was a boy named Big Jim. Big Jim, by the way, matched his name. He was 6'2", he weighed 190 pounds, and it seemed like he didn't have an ounce of respect for any teacher that had walked into that schoolroom. All the kids, by the way, followed Jim's lead. So if Jim was won over, well, then all the rest of the kids would be just fine. But if you could not win Jim over, well, the fact is you could just forget it. And that's what had happened to all the other teachers. Well, they interviewed every person that they interviewed, and they were honest about the situation. And every single one of them said, I don't even feel like dealing with that, except for one man. he said he would take the job. He believed he knew what the problem was. The kids needed someone that they could respect and that respected them back. Somebody that was not afraid to stand for what was right, no matter what it took. The teacher, by the way, his name was Dave, and he had a plan. And it was simply this. He would allow the kids to help him set the class rules. You see, the other teachers came in, and they had rules, and they said, this is what you'll do, and this is how you'll do it. It's just that simple, which immediately, and then they would never uphold the rules, and so immediately they would lose respect. So the first day Teacher Dave got to class, he decided himself that he would introduce himself, and so he did. He had the kids introduce themselves, and then he saw Big Jim. Jim was a formidable young man, solid as a rock. Jim had actually beat up the last two teachers because he didn't agree with what they did. After the intros, the teacher said, okay, class, here's what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to all work together, and we're going to make class rules that we all can live by. But let me go ahead and tell you this. Once they are set, they will be enforced. And they will be enforced as said. Jim said, that sounds fair to me. So all the other kids were on board. No stealing, no cheating, no foul language. And they went through an entire list of things they were going to do. And it was suitable for both the teachers as well as the student. And so the teacher said, okay, now we have the rules that we are going to live by. We must set the punishment in which is going to happen if you break them. But let me remind you one more time, they will be enforced no matter what. If you violate them, you will pay the price. Jim once again said, that sounds fair to me. And all the other kids jumped on board. The punishment was simple. All the kids decided 10 whips across the back with a cane rod if you violate them. Now, everyone agreed on the punishment. Now, the punishment seemed severe enough to deter people from breaking the rules. Jim was on board, so were all the kids. But about 6 weeks into the school year, Jim approached the teacher, and he was upset. It was very visible. He said, sir, somebody stole my lunch. I want to know who did it, and I want them punished. The teacher knew that this was going to be his first test. He knew that if he didn't find out who did it and he didn't follow through, that he would be a person who wasn't a person of their word, and everything else at that point would just start going downhill. So he announced to the class, this is what happened, and he told the story. And after a few moments of silence, a small frail boy named Billy stood up and said, teacher, I took Jim's lunch. It was me. I was very hungry. I'm sorry. Now, Billy wore the same clothes to school every single day. You could tell that he came from a home that didn't really have anything. And while the teacher felt bad about having to whip Billy 10 times on his back, he knew that if he didn't do it, that he would lose respect immediately. So Dave said, Billy, you need to come forward and receive your punishment. Billy came forward. He had a coat on that day, and the teacher said to Billy, Billy, take off your coat, because you know, as we've said, no coats during a whipping, shirts only. That's the rule. Billy had tears streaming down his face and said, please, teacher, don't make me take off my coat. He said, Billy, you heard me. Take off your coat. And when he took off his coat, to the teacher's shock, he had no shirt on. That was the day it was getting washed. The teacher said, I could hear the kids behind me gasp. And Dave said, I could feel a knot forming in my throat. I leaned down and I got close to Billy and I said, Billy, I'm so sorry I've got to do this, but it's the rule. And Billy just cried and said, yes, sir, I know. About that time, Dave said I could feel and heard somebody walking up behind me. And when I looked behind me, there stood Jim. And Jim said to the teacher, teacher, our rule was 10 whips across the back with a cane rod if you violated any of the other ones. But we didn't set a rule that somebody could take the place of punishment for somebody, did we? And Dave thought for a moment and looked and said, no, Jim, I guess we didn't. To which Jim said, well, sir, I want to take Billy's place, if that's okay. Dave said that would be fine. And while Jim was taking the lashings, Billy hung on to his leg and he cried, I am so sorry, Jim. I'll never steal your lunch again. Thank you for what you're doing. To pay the debt for somebody else, it's just not in our mind to do that. Not for somebody that we don't love, not for somebody that we don't have in our family. But you see, that's exactly what Jesus did for you and I. See, he's our kinsman redeemer in the fact and in a way that you and I just can't comprehend. Now, by the way, we can't comprehend it for a couple of different reasons. One, sometimes we just don't try. And other times we just don't care. We can claim the name Christian, that's good enough, whether our walk is good or not. But you see, to too many people, running away from God in their life, that's the easy answer, but it always leads to the wrong thing, where running towards God, that's a better direction to head. You've got to run towards God, but considering all that Jesus has done and the price that he has paid for you and I, how could we not run after him? How could we not cling to him and say, thank you, Lord, for all that you've done. Thank you for the freedom. Thank you for the beating. Thank you for all that I deserved, and yet you took it for me. How in the world could we ever in our right mind not give Christ the credit that's due to him? And yet, you can look at the empty pews and see that some people just don't care. The fact is, sometimes we need to be more aware of what we are doing in our life. We need to be more aware of which way we're running. It's so easy to run away from God. And it's okay to move and start turning towards him. But the most honorable thing is to run after him because you recognize what he's done. And how could you ever give up on him? The question for you as we end today is simply this: what direction are you running? But I hope that you know that it's never, ever too late to change course.